Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. On behalf of my co-convener, Saman Razavi, professor in SENS, we'd like to welcome you to this year's Breakthroughs in Water Security seminar series. This is year 4, and we think, a terrific lineup. Next week is Hoshin Gupta from University of Arizona. Before we get started, we want to thank, as always, Howard Weider, the Canada Excellence Research Chair, and the Global Institute for Water Security. This week, it's a real pleasure to welcome Günter Blöschl. Günter is Professor of Hydrology and Water Resources at the Technical University of Vienna. He's also head of the Institute for Hydraulic Engineering and Water Resource Management and director of the Center for Water Resource Systems, again at TU Vienna. Günter has really been a pioneer in many aspects of hydrologic research, starting with his PhD in snow hydrology in the late 80s. I think your PhD was early 90s. Then some very fundamental work in terms of soil moisture distributions in collaboration with Andrew Western and Roger Grayson in Australia. Some scaling work with SIVA and others that resulted in a special issue of hydrological processes that I think still today defines the field of how we understand scaling, particularly in rainfall runoff. And his more recent work in flood prediction that you'll hear about today. He was one of the key architects of this new area of socio-hydrology, together with SIVA and also HOOB7IA. Now, for all of this, as you can imagine, Günter has been highly awarded and decorated. He's a fellow of the AGU. He's a member of the Austrian Academy of Sciences. He's a Humboldt International Fellow. He's won the International Hydrology Prize given by the IAHS, UNESCO, and WMO, and really our premier medal in the field, the Horton Research Medal from AGU. It's really quite remarkable. And what's remarkable, I think, for me, is his service to the community. He currently sits on the boards of over a dozen journals, and believe it or not, he's editor of 3 of our top journals. He's an editor of Water Resources Research, an editor of HES of the EGU, and he's an editor of the Journal of Hydrology and Hydromechanics. So his level of engagement in the field, I think, is really unprecedented for those working today. He's also been president of the European Geophysical Union, that is the whole union, and he is the incoming president of the International Association of Hydrological Sciences. So it's a real thrill to welcome Günter. We've had a couple of great days. He's just delivered a master class for the students in this course. I think went really well. And I'll turn it over now to Günter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeff, for your kind words. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'll entertain you, I hope, for the next 15 minutes on the topic of breakthroughs in flood research. There have been many big floods around the world in recent years, like 2011 in Thailand, 2011 in Australia, in Central Europe, 2013, 2005. So there's no need to say that floods are extremely important for society, so we need to understand them very well in order to manage them well. So flood research traditionally has proceeded along 2 avenues. The first has been a process-based approach where people look at runoff generation processes in small catchments at the hill slope scale to understand how rainfall turns into runoff and into floods. But when it comes to larger scales, people usually forgot all what they have learned at the hill slope scale and just looked at observed floods in a statistical framework. So what I would like to bring across today, as what I think is the main breakthrough over the last decades, is to link process research with larger scale, link statistical models at larger scales with process understanding both at small and large scales. A term I would call regional process hydrology. I will address 3 science questions in the context of changing floods. First question being, have floods changed in the past? Then what processes control floods? And will floods change in the future? So I'll look at the past, I will look at the present, and I will look at the future. Starting with the past. This, incidentally, is a slide from a snow melt flood, an ice jam flood in Vienna in the year 1830. Here in the foreground, the ice flows. And in those days, people were rescued in style. You see top hats and tailcoat. Things have changed since then. So when we look at hydrological data in Europe, I will really focus on Europe in my talk. Then flood analysis give quite a diverse picture in different parts of the continent. In some parts like England, floods going up, other parts, floods going down. So it's quite a coherent picture, and we would like now to understand why are floods changing, what's happening in the past, in the present, and in the future. And I will specifically use examples from right the center of Europe, from Austria. So this is a schematic data from the Danube at Vienna. This is a catchment area of 100,000 square kilometers, and each bar represents the magnitude of the annual flood, the biggest discharge of the Danube at Vienna in any one year since 1828. So when you look at this graph, it will give you a first impression of whether floods are increasing or not. So what you see is like small floods that are increasing a little bit, but the big guys, it's hard to tell. There are only so few of them. So this is one of the issues here. You have a small sample. How can we tell whether floods are increasing or not? I will specifically now look at 4 of these biggest floods, 1899, 1954, 2002, 2013. This is the rainfall distribution for these 4 floods. We see here the Danube basin. Vienna is down here. Munich would be over here. So this is southern Germany. Here are the Alps in Austria. And what we see here is for these 4 flood events, a lot of rainfall at the northern fringe of the Alps, because here is the Alpine region, and we get a lot of orographic precipitation where the mountains start. The 4 floods are similar, but the 1899 flood has received a lot more rainfall. 500 millimeters of rainfall here at the northern rim of the Alps, which is a lot of rain. 500 millimeters, half a meter of rainfall in only a couple of days, producing this flood. Now, when we go back one slide, we see 1899 flood was not bigger than all the other floods, but even though it received almost twice the rainfall. How is that? How can that be? Twice the rainfall and the same magnitude of the floods. And the reason is hydrology. The soil moisture was different. In 1899, this was a September flood after a dry summer, so much of the water was soaked up by the soil and did not go to the streams. While in the other years, in particular in 2013, we had a wet spring, and all the water flew off the hill slopes into the streams and into the Danube, which from a flood management perspective is quite remarkable, because flood managers will wonder, if you get this rainfall after a wet spring, we will get an even bigger flood than what we have seen in the past 200 years. I will now zoom into Passau, which is the city here in Bavaria at the border to Austria. This is at the confluence of 2 rivers, the Inn River and the Danube River. And the interesting thing is here that we have good records of the floods over the past 500 years, actually. The largest flood occurred in 1501 on the 15th of August. This is the flood mark at the city hall of Passau. And the water here, you see the capillary fringe of the 2013 flood. So it was almost the same magnitude as the largest flood in the past 500 years. Passau is at the confluence of 2 rivers, of the Inn and the Danube. And you see here the flood hydrographs of the 2 rivers. The blue one is the one of the Inn. This is an alpine river, high rainfall, fast runoff response, which gives a very fast increase in the flood hydrograph and a large peak. And the other tributary, the northern tributary, is from the flatlands. Even though the catchment area is much bigger, almost 3 times the size of the other one, we get a much more subdued and slower hydrograph, because more water goes into the subsurface and travel times are longer. And then below the confluence, this is the red line, you get the superposition of these 2 flood hydrographs for these 4 events. And now the interesting thing is when the timing of the flood hydrograph shifts, then the superposition will shift. For example, if the blue hydrograph is delayed because of flood retention, there will be synchronization and superposition with the peak of the other tributary, which may actually increase the flood peak downstream. So interesting interactions at river confluences. These are two of these big floods, 1899 and 2013, zoomed in with a volume of about 6 billion cubic meters of water. So the water volume that came down was 6 billion cubic meters of water, a lot of water. And the flood retention in the floodplains for these two floods was quite different. In 1899, we had a volume of water of 2 billion cubic meters of water stored in the floodplain. Around 1,000 square kilometers were flooded during this event. But 2013, more than 100 years later, there was much less inundation because of flood protection. The floodplains were protected by levees. We only had 500 million cubic meters of water in the floodplains. How do we know? Because we have excellent maps of the 1899 event, and then you can simulate the effect of the flood retention for the 2013 flood. So if we had the same flood retention area, this would have increased the flood, decreased the flood peak. So this is the map of the 1899 flood. The brown curves are the rainfall distribution. Up here is Passau. Vienna would be down here. This is the Danube. And the blue areas are the inundated areas during the 1899 flood. 2013, we have a lot of flood protection, including mobile walls that are erected here just before the flood comes in order to protect the floodplain population and infrastructure. Now, when we look at the floods in a spatial context, we can analyze observations, flood data at many stream gauges. This is Austria, 500 kilometers across. The western part is the Alpine part, the mountainous part. Each point here shows the analysis of one stream gauge, one location at the stream, and the blue points indicate whether the floods have increased over the past 60 years or 30 years, and the red points show where the floods have decreased. So what we see if we look at the floods from a long-term perspective, there's some small decrease, light blue meaning small increases, but if we look at it for a shorter observation period, 30 years, there are quite significant increases in the flood discharges. And now you will ask, why is it that floods have increased over those 30 years in this part of Central Europe? Is it rainfall, or is it land use change, or is it levees, river draining? And we analyze these data now from a statistical perspective in a paper that has only appeared a couple of weeks ago in Water Resources Research. And the idea is that we link changes in the river floods, in observed river floods, to three drivers. The first driver is land use changes, reduced infiltration. The second is climate, increased rainfall. And the third would be river draining, straightening of the river channels, or loss of flood retention in the floodplains. And the hypothesis effect here in this study that these effects of land use, climate, and river draining depend on the catchment scale. For the small catchments, land use has the largest effect, and the climate affects river floods at all catchment sizes, and river draining is most important for the lowland river in the lower reaches of the stream. So this is the hypothesis. And then we analyze the data you just seen in the previous slide in terms of these drivers by what we call flood change attribution. We analyze the trends in the past 40 years for each stream gauge. Each plot is a stream gauge as a function of catchment size, small catchments from 10 square kilometers to 100,000 square kilometers, and by assuming changes of the effects of the drivers on the river floods, we can back calculate the contributions of the drivers. So we are now no longer looking at the absolute value of the changes in the floods, but only by the degree to which these changes in the floods change with the catchment size. So the reasoning is the land use change will be more important in smaller catchments and river draining in larger catchments. So by only using the scaling exponent, that is the change in the effect with catchment area, we can back calculate the effects on the river floods, and this is done by a Bayesian analysis, which allows us to back out both the the contributions and their uncertainty. So this is the result of this analysis based on 100 catchments in Austria. On the vertical axis, the relative contributions to the flood change by 3 drivers. On the horizontal axis, the catchment size. And what we see, indeed, for the smallest catchment, land use is most relevant. Climate is particularly relevant for intermediate catchment scales. And as the catchment size increases, river draining becomes more important, published in Water Resources Research 2 months ago. This was the past. Now let's look at the processes. Particularly interesting, how are floods generated and how are they changing currently? What are the drivers of flood changes? And let's look at rainfall first. Of course, river floods, the main driver is rainfall. And one wonders, have the weather system changed? Particularly in Europe, weather systems usually they come from Newfoundland across the Atlantic, and then they have some interesting patterns, some of them going across the Mediterranean, some of them coming from the north, particularly in winter. So we did an analysis. A student of mine, Michael Hofstetter, analyzed pressure fields and rainfall over Europe to understand whether the storm tracks have changed in the past 60 years. So each of the big storms that produce floods, he tracked in space and time, getting these traces, and then he classified the storm tracks by their location and by their direction in order to understand whether particular types of storms have increased in their number or not. This is one particular type. This is a southern track where the storm tracks go this direction to the south, east, and east. And this is the frequency of this type of storms. And we see indeed this kind of storm track has increased in frequency in the past 20 years. But depending on what storm type, whether they come from the north, west, or east, you look at some of them you get increases, some of them you get actually decreases. And the storm track type actually matters a lot for the magnitude of the floods you can get. This is a distribution of extreme rainfall in one particular part in Germany, where we looked at the probability of extreme rainfall as a function of these storm track types. This XXS was the type I just shown before. But the more relevant type is another type. It's called 5B weather type that picks up energy and moisture over the Mediterranean and has produced some of the largest floods in Central Europe, such as those in 2013 and 2002. And you can see here by the analysis, a 95 non-exceedance probability gives 25 millimeters for the southern storm track, but 62 millimeters for the more threatening, more hazardous storm track. So really it's important to look at the storm tracks differently and how they impact floods, how they change over time. But it's not only the storms, the rainfall that's important. Often floods are a combination of different factors. A combination of snow melt, then rain on snow. Small catchments often have flash floods. It means convective cells that produce flood runoff over a very limited area. And in the flatlands, we have synoptic floods, such as those where the storm tracks in the previous slide are relevant. So in order to get a better understanding how the variability of floods is related to the different runoff generation mechanisms, snow melt, flash floods, rain on snow, and flatlands, we classified a large number of floods in Austria by their process mechanism. So this is the flood frequency curve. On the horizontal axis, we have the return period, which is a measure of the probability of the occurrence of the flood. On the vertical axis, the flood peak. So here, the big floods. Down here are the small floods. And the color coding shows you the storm type. For example, the second largest on record here was a flash flood in this particular catchment in Austria. And the largest flood was a synoptic flood. And the rain on snow floods are really the smaller floods in this catchment. So usually, people would only do a flood frequency analysis. They would plot the flood magnitude against the return period without considering the runoff generation process types. But here we added color to the graph to understand what are the reasons for these particular events to occur. And we can do this for many catchments in Austria. Appeared 2004 in Water Resources Research. So this is Austria, 500 kilometers across. And each graph shows us the frequency of the occurrence of one particular flood type. Green and yellow is low frequency, and red and blue is a high frequency. For example, we see here snowmelt floods are most frequent in the mountains. Rain on snow floods are most frequent in the northern lowlands. They occur in winter. Flash floods, particularly in the east, but not very frequent. And synoptic flood, they are really the largest contribution to big floods in Austria. So we can now disentangle the different processes to not only get a flood magnitude in space, but also understand what are the drivers in terms of rain, snow, and flash floods. In a simpler analysis, because this kind of classification is quite involved, in a simple analysis, we can only look at the time of the year the floods occur. In a country where you have always spring floods, this is sort of trivial, but Central Europe is quite complex. You have a mix of all sorts of flood generating processes, and then by understanding whether you have winter floods, spring floods, summer floods, this sheds light on the runoff generation mechanisms. And we did this for Switzerland, Austria, parts of Slovakia, in terms of looking at the timing within the year the extreme rainfall occurs. The arrow in the graph here points to the direction of the time of the year the floods occur. So if the arrows go to the left, it means summer floods. If they point downwards, this means autumn floods here. So in Austria, in the northern lowlands, we have mainly summer rainfall, and in the south, northern Italy, we have autumn rainfall. And this rainfall, in terms of the seasonality, translates into floods. Summer floods in most of the Alpine area, autumn floods here in northern Italy, but winter floods in Bavaria and northern Austria. And you wonder, why is it that you have summer rainfall but winter floods? How can that be? These floods are produced by rainfall. How come you have winter floods even though the biggest storms occur in summer? And this has to do with soil moisture. Soil moisture is highest in winter. Then even though you get smaller storms in winter, the high soil moisture contributes to bigger floods in winter than in summer. That's why we get winter floods in this part of Central Europe. In a European project I'm currently coordinating, we look at floods in all of Europe. So we do cross-sections across Europe to understand exactly these processes of flood changes, and we look at flood seasonality and many other things. For example, a cross-section through the Alps and Slovakia, we plotted here in the lower panel the elevation, here the mountains, here the flatlands, and here the Tatra mountains. And the color coding here is the time of the year the floods have occurred. The blue colors being summer floods, the red colors being summer floods, the blue colors being winter floods, green is spring floods. And we not only see spatial patterns of more summer floods in the mountains, more winter floods in the lowlands, as in the previous slide, we can also look at the time change. What we see here is that in recent years, 2000, 2010, there are more winter floods in higher elevation than previously, and this has to do with the change of the regime, with warmer temperatures. Because of that, we have more rainfall in higher elevations, and therefore a change from summer floods to spring and winter floods. It's not only the rainfall and the snowfall that is important, but also what's happening to the snow melt and the rain on the ground. And this is usually analyzed in studies in research catchments. We are operating such a research catchment in Austria. It's called the Hydrological Open Air Laboratory, which is a highly instrumented catchment here in the landscape, 60 hectares, and just to give you some reference, 800 millimeters of rainfall, 2,000 millimeters of runoff. So this is how the runoff generation processes are usually studied, the different mechanisms we consider in hydrology, such as infiltration excess, overland flow, re-infiltration, saturation excess, overland flow, tile drainage, spring runoff, etc. But this would be a completely different talk. I will not go into depth here about these runoff generation processes at the local scale, but I will ask the question, if we go to larger catchments, we cannot do all these detailed research as we are doing here in this research catchment. How can we take the process understanding from the hill slope scale to larger catchments and the regional scale? And I will illustrate one example of how we did this here. Example from the mountains in Tirol, 70 square kilometers, which is not a research catchment. This was a part of a dissertation in my group, Magdalena Rogger, where she looked at a catchment to identify runoff generation processes in a more general way in order to capture what's going on in an approximate way in the entire catchment. We looked at the subsurface, whether the subsurface matters. It does for flood generation. We mapped the hydrogeological units and geomorphological feature in the catchments on the basis of the sediment depth, looking at deep creeping areas on the basis of reconnaissance strips in the catchment, on the basis of aerial photographs and digital elevation models, in order to identify zones of different groundwater storage that is relevant to flood generation. So the green areas are the areas that have runoff in deep groundwater, light green is runoff in shallow groundwater, and red would be surface runoff on rocks. That is, this hydrogeological mapping over this catchment gives us an indication of how much of the rainwater can be stored that will not contribute to this particular flood. So the subsurface matters, but also the surface matters, and we did a second mapping for the surface feature of these catchments: roughness, saturated areas, dynamic river network, infiltration potential by indicator plants. So together with biologists, we looked at different plant species in the catchments, like blueberry, lingonberry, etc. They are indicators of the soil moistures. The blueberries are indicators of dry soils, and kingcup an indicator of wet soils, which gives us an indication, a rough indication of the spatial distribution of the soil moisture in the catchment as an indicator of runoff generation mechanisms. And we combined all this information into a hydrological model, a distributed hydrological model, and did some Monte Carlo simulation of flood probabilities, flood frequencies. And this is one example, simulated for this catchment. On the vertical axis, the peak discharge, the flood magnitude. On the horizontal axis, the return period. So the larger the return period, the bigger the flood. And usually when you have data, you just get the curve. But now with a model, based on the field analysis, we can also understand where does the water come from? What is the contribution to a flood of a particular magnitude? So when we have a small flood, 1.5 years return period, then the model tells us the blue areas in the catchment are saturated. And as the flood event magnitudes go bigger, more and more of the catchment is saturated. Blue means saturated. Still bigger floods have a much bigger saturated area, and it's interesting, in some catchment you have actually quite a step change. When the event size, the rainfall, increases a little bit more, then you have a sudden increase in the saturated area, depending on the spatial distributions of the soils in the area. So here is the step change. If the rainfall increases just a little bit, you have a big change in the rainfall, which produces a kink, a step change in the flood frequency curve. Something that is usually not considered. Usually we just fit a smooth curve to the flood data. Okay, so I looked at rainfall, snowfall, the ground runoff generation processes, and now I would like to link these things, the rainfall with the surface. This is because we often observe that environments that have a lot of rainfall, intensive rainfall, are also those environments that are most conducive to producing surface runoff. We often observe a feedback between the atmospheric processes and the landscape and soil evolution. And this is one example to illustrate these feedbacks. Two regions in Austria. The Gurk region, this is this landscape, produces very slow responding hydrographs. So these are two catchments of similar sizes, around 300 square kilometers. And the hydrographs here, same time scale, they're very slowly responding. While in the other region, same catchment size, we have a very fast catchment response. Why is that? It has to do with the interplay between rainfall, soil erosion, land cover, and landform evolution. We have rocks that are subject to weathering, deeper soils, flatter terrain, gradients, but also longer rainstorms. And here we have deeply incised channels, high intensity rainstorms. There is a feedback of these processes. You can see this in the landform of these two regions and also in the stream network. This is the region with the slow response, quite a convoluted stream network, while the region with a fast runoff response has a very efficient stream network. So very interesting interactions between these processes with a strong control of the geology. This is an example from Austria of two regions with very different runoff response. Here, this yellow region is a fast runoff response, fleshy hydrographs. Here, a slow runoff response, which is strongly correlated with the geology of the area. So it's not only the soil, but also the deeper subsurface that matters a lot for runoff response. And this can be put into a framework of different timescales. Traditionally, particularly in engineering hydrology, we only looked at the flood hydrograph. In this schematic, the blue lines are the arrows connecting processes relating to events. This is the time, the duration of the rainfall of an event, which together of the time scale of the catchment response, like a unit hydrograph, contributes to the response time of the flood hydrograph. This is at the event scale, but this should be nested at longest time scales, into time scales of soil moisture, at the seasonal time scale, even longer time scales of soil evolution, and still longer time scales of landform evolution. So the traditional view was to only look at event hydrographs, but I think in order to understand these feedbacks between atmospheric processes, landform evolution, soils, vegetation, we need to look at these feedbacks across many timescales. Third part of my presentation, the future predictions. So we would like to know what's happening in the future. The typical way of doing that is to run simulations with global circulation models. This is one such simulation for the European Alps. The red line, these are the simulations of the GCMs. The green lines are the observations of winter precipitation in this particular region. The green line are the observations with a data set called HISTALP from 1860 to the present. You see that we have quite long records to test the models, and then you can use this kind of model output to see what's happening in the future. And here, this model would show a slight increase in winter precipitation. And usually people take this GCM output, run it, maybe downscale it to smaller scales, and feed a rainfall runoff model with this output, and then you get a simulated hydrograph, a flood hydrograph, and sometimes you get an increase in floods, a decrease in the floods, and then so what? So you have all these scenarios, but it's very difficult to understand how reliable they are and really what they mean. It's really a black box output, which is a nice picture, but very hard to understand. So for a project we did for the Austrian government, we took a slightly different approach. We classified the macro scale processes on flood changes in a conceptual way, rather than running like thousands of years of GCM output through a rainfall runoff model. We've conceptualized what would be the main mechanisms that would increase flooding in Austria. And we classified them into 4 groups. The first group is increasing winter precipitation. Second group is increasing convective precipitation, particularly in summer, particularly relevant in small catchments. Higher snowfall line, meaning there's more rainfall and less snowfall because of warmer temperatures. And earlier snowmelt and higher evaporation, essentially because of warmer temperatures. And these phases here, they are indications of how sure we are that these things are going to happen. There's like indicators of uncertainty. We are pretty sure that air temperatures will be increasing in the future. In the European Alps, air temperatures have increased by 1.5 degrees in the past 30 years, quite dramatic. So you see real changes. But we're not so sure about rainfall. We are particularly unsure about convective precipitation. That's very hard to measure. It's very difficult to actually demonstrate based on observations whether convective precipitation is increasing or not. So we have these 4 mechanisms, and we're now running the model simulations separately for these 4 mechanisms for Austria, and this is the model output. The color coding suggests whether the 100-year flood increases or decreases, blue being an increase in the 100-year flood, red a decrease. So when we look at convective precipitation, it pretty much increases floods everywhere in the country. Of course, more precipitation, fleshier response, bigger floods. But we're not sure about that. Then winter precipitation, this really depends on what the predictions of the GCMs tell us, and this particular CLM scenario, prediction we used produced less winter floods in the west and more winter flood in the east. This is essentially what you see in the flooding also. Snowfall line, higher snowfall line will also always increase the flooding, particularly because we have mainly summer floods in Austria, and snow and evaporation, there's a tendency for decreasing floods in essentially all of the country. Then when you superimpose everything, what do you get? It's quite a complex pattern. This, looking at it separately gives us better insight of what's going on. It's a convoluted picture. What we can see quite clearly is changes in the time of the year the floods occur. These are two regions. This is the mountainous region in Tirol, and these are lowlands in the northeast of the country. In the mountains, we have summer floods. The black bars are the number of floods per year simulated in the past, and the red bars are the number of floods per month, floods per month simulated for the future. So it's essentially summer floods, and there's a slight change from more floods in May, but not much change in the mountains. When you look at the lowlands, there's quite a dramatic change. Again, the black bars are the monthly frequency of the floods in the past and the rate in the future. We get quite a substantial increase of winter floods in the lowlands. And based on these separate simulations for the mechanisms, we can attribute these changes of why this is happening. And it's mainly happening because of a larger contribution of rainfall and a smaller contribution of snowfall in this part of the country. We can use the same simulations to estimate the runoff coefficients and again monthly flood frequency. So here what we plotted here is the flood probabilities, the 100-year floods for each month of the year. You can do annual values and monthly values, not much change in Tirol, but big changes for increasing winter floods in the lowlands. So when you have any future changes in flood discharges, you're also interested in what it means for inundation. And the typical method for assessing the effects on assets, on infrastructure, is to run hydrodynamic simulations. And there's a recent trend, what I would call a breakthrough, for high-resolution models, for models that are able to simulate large areas with very high resolution. And one of the foci in our research program is to develop code that is extremely efficient in simulating flood inundations. We do this for very high resolution, digital elevation models, taking advantage of the graphics processing units, GPUs of the processors, which gives us a 10 or 20 or 30-fold increase in the computation time. Including a new numerical scheme we have developed and visualization analysis. And I will illustrate this modeling for one particular case. This is the Rhine River in Germany, and the city is Cologne. And what we have simulated here is the effect of a breach of the flood protection. So most of Cologne, of the inner city, is protected by mobile walls they erect just before the flood is arriving. This green line is this mobile wall, and we wonder now what's happening if this mobile wall is breached. In what way will the water flood the city? And it's important to know these things for real-time management of the floods and also for training the staff. So I will now play a movie. So here is the breach. And we see water is entering the city. The color coding of the building is the inundation depth. So red would be more than a meter. And this is how the water progresses into the city. So we're now in the process of using this simulation software to simulate large areas, thousands of kilometers, which is possible because of the efficiency of the code. Okay, now talking about assets and the effect of infrastructure, when we take a long-term perspective, we are also interested in the feedbacks between the floods and the human side of things. In a similar way as I have looked at the interplay, the feedbacks between climate, soils, vegetation, landform. And now looking at the interplay of floods and people from a long-term perspective. So it's not for the next 4 years where we usually run these scenarios, but to take a longer-term perspective of 20, 50, or 100 years. And this is part of a research focus, which Jeff has mentioned, which is termed Socio-Hydrology, which looks at longer-term coupling of the human and the water system from a modeling perspective. And to illustrate the point of this coupling, why it is useful to couple the two systems, I will give a hypothetical example of the interplay of flooding and people in a floodplain. There are two cases. A case that I call a green society. This is a society that lives next to the river, but it does not build levees, no flood protection. In order to reduce the flood risk, they will move away from the river rather than protect themselves. And there is the techno society, which in order to protect themselves, they build levees. So there are two different policies of strategies to manage their floods. Both societies in the model have benefits of living near the river, but there is also flood damage if they live near the river in case a flood occurs. And there is a feedback with the social processes. In case a flood occurs, there's a shock. People will become more flood aware, and then they will build dams in case of the techno society. So what do we see here? First, the equations of the model. This is a set of coupled differential equations that represents the coupling between the hydrology, the flood processes, the economy, the politics, which is essentially land use planning, society, flood risk awareness, and technology, the building of the levees. Usually when we do this kind of assessment study, we prescribe the level of the flood protection, but not in this model. In this model, the flood level is simulated in this hypothetical case. So these are the equation, an equation for the economy, one for politics, G is the wealth, D is the distance from the stream, H is the level of the flood protection, M is a variable that's called memory. This is how flood aware the community is. And this is the feedback of the building of the levees. Because of the constriction of the floodplain, the levees will increase the flood magnitudes downstream. So what we get with this kind of model is shown here. This is the input, the water level of the floods over a period of 200 years, hypothetical region. And this is one of the first model outputs, the flood risk awareness. The vertical axis shows you how aware the community is of the floods. If there are lots of floods, like here, then there's a high flood awareness, but then there's a period of fewer floods, so people forget. And there are more floods, then people again raise the awareness. There's a long period without floods, and people just forget and move closer to the river. And then there's another period of floods, and people become more flood aware. This is the level of the flood protection. You can think of it of the height of the levee. At the beginning, we started with an initial condition of 0, and then people started to build dams, and they forget, and the dams decay. And then another period of floods, the levees are increased further. Now, the interesting thing is the feedback. For these two societies, the green society at the top and the techno society at the bottom. The green society, essentially, if there is a flood, there is damage. And the period with fewer floods, less damage, and the period with more floods, there is more damage. So it's pretty proportional to the magnitude of the floods. Not so in the techno society. It is similar at the beginning when there are no levees, no flood protection. But then here, people start to build a dam and they get protected. So these floods here, they never translate into damage because people are protected. The floods do not overtop the levees. But then there is a period of few floods. What happens? People forget, and then when a period of floods occurs after like 50 years, the flood protection level is low, but people have moved close to the river. This is an effect that's called the levee effect. So they are more vulnerable, and the flood damage is much bigger than it is for the green society, where people have not moved so close. So they are lulled into false sense of security to build close to the river, and when the big floods occur, there's a lot of damage. So there are interesting feedbacks if you look at the long time scale between the social processes and the hydrology. So talking about the memory of people, usually I would think, well, it's a bad thing. People forget. Why do they forget that floods are important? Why do they move back? So I always held the opinion, well, people should never forget. But this model shows us this is actually not an optimum decision, because if people forget quickly, the memory is short. This is a sensitivity analysis. Horizontal axis, the memory, how quickly people forget. So short memory means people forget quickly. Then there's excessive damage. To just stay next to the river all the time, they get flood damage every year. So the wealth of the city, you want to be high, a high wealth is low. If there is a very long memory, which means people never forget, there are missed opportunities. They don't move close to the river, which is less beneficial economically, which is neither very good for the wealth of the city. But there is some intermediate collective memory, which is on the order of the 10, 20, or 30 years, where the development of the city is at a more optimum. So an intermediate memory for this kind of modeling system is an optimum. And you can now look at longer time series, 2,000 years in this case, and allow for the sequence of the floods to vary. Usually in engineering hydrology, we look just at the probability of the floods, the flood frequency curve, probability that a particular flood discharge is exceeded in a particular year. We do not look at the sequence of the floods. But this model tells us that the sequence of the floods is very important. It matters if two floods occur in a row or at the longer distance. We have plotted here one particular parameter set, the wealth of the city. You want to be high against time. And the grayscale tells us the probability that the evolution of the wealth of this community follows a particular path. It can either go down or it can go up. So you have a bimodal distribution of the positive or negative development of the community depending on the sequence of the flooding. So these are interactions you usually do not consider in hydrological analysis. Okay, let me conclude. Changing river floods. Have floods changed in the past? Yes, in a complex manner. And climate, land use, river training are important drivers. What processes control floods? Climate, circulation patterns, snow, soil moisture. The subsurface does matter. It's not only surface flow. And landform soil climate feedbacks are important. And they may actually be one of the vehicles to better understand hydrological processes in landscapes where we have sparse data. And thirdly, will floods change in the future? Yeah, they very likely will, but in a very complex manner, and we need to account for uncertainties and for the long-term feedbacks between people and water if we're interested in the very long time scales. So the name of the series here is Breakthroughs, and I was just presenting my own research, though I really did not want to talk about breakthroughs, more like about progress. But I think a lot of progress has been made in understanding how floods work, particularly regarding to linking small-scale process knowledge to larger scale. So the understanding of regional flood generation processes where the societal relevance is largest, an area I would call regional process hydrology. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much, Günter. That was simply a marvelous talk, not just past, present, and future, but some engineering, some science, some biology, and ending with sociology. So thank you very much. Time for some questions as I look out in the audience. And as you, yeah, Andrew.
Okay.
Perhaps just repeat the question briefly if you could. Yeah.
The question was, we have made a lot of progress in understanding floods. What about predicting floods? Okay, from my perspective, these two issues are closely related, because ultimately the proof of whether you understand this system is whether you're able to predict it. If you're not able to predict, it's not science. Science means prediction. So the understanding immediately translates into prediction of floods. Then, of course, in hydrology, we have two streams of predicting floods. One is flood magnitudes in the short term over the next hours or days, flood forecasts. And this again would be a separate talk. We have developed most of the flood forecasting systems in Austria. And a lot of progress has made on that as well, particularly with operational methods such as data assimilation. I think we're doing much better than we've done in the past, also quantitative precipitation forecasting. But then the other prediction is probabilistic prediction, whether we can estimate 100-year flood better than we did in the past. And I showed a number of examples, actually, of flood probabilities in this presentation.
Yeah, Bing.
Yeah, thank you. The question was that I have talked about the role of memory on risk, but what is the role of government? That's a very valid point. The model is quite simplistic. It's like a first-order differential equation about the memory, just one memory for the community, but in reality, things are much more complex. There are different interest groups in a community. There is government. And the way I look at it is it's really a multi-tiered process, cultural process of societal decisions at different time scales. You know, there are like short-term processes, what is in the newspapers. Now, when there is a flood, you see it in the newspapers, but a week later, people have forgotten it and something else is on the news. That's the very short-scale memory process. Then there's a longer-term process. If people are personally affected, they will remember the flood for quite a while. But then there is also the governance, different levels of governance structures, laws that are passed, or at the longest level is a constitution. So there are different tiers. They all have different time scales. And in principle, these could be incorporated in these models, these kind of models, but this would make the models much more complex, of course.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Not enough time, right? So I cut the presentation a bit so to fit into the 45 minutes. Yeah, soil moisture is very relevant. One example of the effect of soil moisture was the very first example of the 1899 storm in September related to the 2013 storm in June after a wet spring. So there are figures in the publication that I've noted that shows you that we had a much larger soil moisture which related in almost twice the flood peak with the same rainfall. So, and we have many examples where we can very clearly see the effect of soil moisture on the flood peaks. And there's essentially always the same effect. Higher soil moisture produces flood peaks, which is quite interesting because floods are produced by many different mechanisms, infiltration excess, saturation excess, subsurface storm flow, but the effect of soil moisture invariably is the same. You have higher soil moisture in medium-sized, large catchments, you invariably get more flood peaks. And the way we account for soil moisture is in two ways. On the one hand, through modeling, that is soil moisture accounting, where we balance rainfall against evaporation. But we also have done a lot of work together with remote sensing people in my university on satellite data of soil moisture. So we've analyzed SCAT soil moisture data, ES1 and ES2 soil moisture data, albeit at larger scales. At smaller scales, you really need to do more fieldwork kind of things. And in our research catchments, we also have like a network, distributed network of soil moisture sensors to look at small-scale processes. So soil moisture can be measured at many scales, and at all scales. It's very important for runoff generation in this climate.
Yes, down here.
Soil frost. Okay, question was, what is the effect of soil frost on winter floods? Here I must say, in Central Europe, this is very poorly understood. This is probably why you here in Canada have much more progress than we have in Europe. Most models just ignore frost processes, and there's very little field observation. One example where we did observe this kind of process was in our research catchment, where we looked at the data, and suddenly their streamflow was increasing in winter, January. There was no snow on the ground, there was no rainfall. So why do we have an increase? It was a small flood of streamflow. And this was because of thawing processes. So the soil was frozen and wet, and because of the sun, there was thaw, and the soil moisture just ran into the stream and increased the flood hydrograph. But these are processes that few of the models that we are using actually incorporate, and this is certainly one of the areas where we need to do more research.
Yes, Yan Ping.
Okay, can you just repeat your question? It was not clear to me. Speak up, there is the fan, I can hear you very well.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, you showed a nice correlation, seasonal correlation between precipitation and flooding frequency, right? And I just wonder, the precipitation, like the vectors you showed, is like mainly precipitation amount or precipitation intensity, or both?
Yeah. Okay, the question was whether rainfall, the correlation between rainfall and floods is only in terms of the month, but also in terms of the magnitudes, whether the month of rainfall translates into months of floods, or also the magnitudes of rainfall translates into the magnitude of the floods.
And intensity.
And the intensity.
Yeah.
From our experience is actually there is an interplay between the seasonality the storms occur with the seasonality of the soil moisture. So when you get winter rainfall and high soil moisture in winter, you get higher winter floods. But if there is a shift in the rainfall regime for more summer storms and fewer winter storms, you get a shift in the flood regime and potentially increases or decreases in the flooding. And sometimes the intensity is increasing, sometimes their depth is increasing. What we see in the storms in Austria in the past 30 years, where I showed the increases in the floods due to rainfall, about half the increases in the rainfall is due to an increase in the depth of the rainfall, and half of it is an increase in the frequency of the rainfall. So we both have more frequent storms and higher intensity storms.
Thank you.
Saman, and then to the back.
So you explained different feedback mechanisms working at different time scales. I wonder, how do you envision the modeling efforts would look like in the future to include different scales or different feedback mechanisms across a range of scales or time scales?
At a range of time scales. Okay. We have a broad field of research in floods. So I think there is opportunity for doing research at multiple time scales. As our records are getting longer, we have opportunity to look at trends. So when I started my career 30 years ago, nobody looked at trends in floods, and not because they were not interested in trends, but because the records were just not available. So in the 80s, people looked at individual flood hydrographs, not even at continuous records during the year. So I think the opportunities of examining flood processes across timescales have a lot to do with our observational opportunities. As the records are getting longer, there are more opportunities for longer studies. And as the instruments are getting higher resolution, both in space and time, we get better opportunities to look at high frequency response. For example, in the research catchments, all our observations are at the time resolution of 1 minute. And 30 years ago, we would not do that. Including isotopic data are now like 10-minute, 50-minute resolution. We never could do that before. So we're expanding our observational opportunities and abilities to longer time scales and to shorter time scales, thus increasing our spectrum of observation. I think this is where a lot of progress comes from.
Good. Graham.
Thanks for your talk. I wonder if you've considered looking at how the seasonality of the flood affects the risk perception in terms of memory.
Yeah, we did look at that. For some damages or some risk sources, it really does not matter so much what time of the year floods occur. So if you think of infrastructure, industry operating year-round, it really doesn't matter so much whether you have summer floods or have winter floods. For other things, it does matter. For example, agricultural damages or the trafficability of fields. If you get floods, a shift of the timing of the floods from summer to the growing season, earlier in the season, you get damages, agricultural damages, because of poor trafficability and maybe higher erosion that you would not get otherwise, even though the magnitude of the floods do not change. There may be ecological increased risk, for example, when floods affect the runs of salmon runs, for example. Or there may be other effects on hydropower operation, where the timing of the floods affects the operation of the hydropower dams. So these are more subtle changes, which usually are not so well researched. But this is actually something we are looking at. We're just working on a study currently to look at changes in the timing of the river floods throughout Europe. And we see some interesting results of earlier and later floods, which are related mainly to climate change, to changes in the weather systems, to changes in the snow melt, and also changes in the temperature of the Mediterranean Sea, which feedbacks on the rainfall processes in the coastal areas.
Okay. Before I see if there's a final question out there, perhaps I'll just ask, the flip side of floods or droughts.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if there's been work to kind of look at the connection between the two. This is maybe extreme memory now, but I know in some systems there's, for floods that follow droughts, there's very little memory of that drought situation, and some there's extreme link between the two. And I'm wondering if that connection's been explored at all.
Yeah, I'd like to answer this question two ways. First, from a physical perspective, in Europe there are very strong links between floods and droughts. So when one part of Europe floods, it's likely that another part of Europe has a drought. And this has a lot to do with the atmospheric water balance. The water that goes somewhere in excess is missing somewhere else. So we very often have this dipole behavior of floods in one region and droughts in the other region. That's quite a common observation. The other perspective I would like to answer your question is from more the local perception perspective. When we had the 2013 flood in Central Europe, it was at the beginning of June. It was, as I mentioned, more than a 100-year flood, the biggest flood we've observed for more than 100 years. It was all of the newspapers and TV interviews and radio interviews. And then we did an analysis of the flood, which we finished like a week after the flood had stopped. And then I contacted the journalist that just had talked the previous week. Well, now we have the data. We can now demonstrate exactly how the flood worked. And the journalist would say, floods? We have a drought. I'm not interested in that. It was only a week after the flood had stopped. So the memory, particularly in the media, is really very short. And the lesson for us in hydrology is we should use the window of opportunity. Use the window of opportunity when there is a flood, when there's a drought. Use the time in order to get our message across.
Is there a final question? Maybe Ali. Yeah.
Follow up on Jeff's question. I think the sister of flood is water quality issues.
Mm-hmm.
Particularly in Prairie, we had flood in Calgary in 2011, and mainly because the factors you mentioned, land use change. They changed the number of wetlands, they drained many wetlands, and that flood has been highly attributed to the land cover change. At the same time, we had eutrophication of the water resources. We had eutrophication of the Lake Winnipeg, which again can be attributed to the land cover change.
I think there are lots of interactions between floods and water quality depending on the setting. Your example was one of them, with nutrients being affected by flood levels, but there are many others. One of them is, for example, when you have inundation of floodplains and people have oil tanks for heating in their basement, and the oil tanks are flooded and produces a lot of damage. It was a huge problem for the 2002 flood in Central Europe. Other problems are health issues. So when you have an extended flood, the water quality deteriorates and you have infection outbreaks. So there are lots of interactions between floods and water quality problems depending on the setting. And yes, and this would be a very interesting research area to study from a general perspective, perhaps classify the different cases.
Good. I think we're going to draw it to an end. I want to thank Günter again for really a stimulating talk and remind everyone that we're heading to Alexander's for a beer. You're welcome to join us. We'll be upstairs at a table, and if you have some one-on-one time you'd like with Günter, then please join us. And remember, next week is Hoshin Gupta, and Saman, I think it's here. Okay, and where will it be at Innovation Place? Okay. There will be emails sent. Anyway, there's an exceptional talk next week with Hoshin Gupta, but in a different location, I think, for that 1 week. Anyway, thanks again, Günter.